The first thing Elias noticed wasn't the peeling wallpaper or the smell of stale rain in his cramped apartment. It was the silence of a daughter who had forgotten how to laugh. When Elias stepped off the bus, the humid city air felt like a physical weight against his chest, a thick blanket of urban exhaust and summer rot. His prosthetic leg clicked rhythmically against the cracked pavement, a hollow mechanical talk that served as a constant reminder of the landmine that had rewritten his DNA in a valley 5,000 miles away. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the sterile white-tiled wards of the VA hospital. The door swinging open, the squeal of delight, the frantic hug that would make him feel whole again despite the missing limbs. But when he pushed open the door to apartment for C, reality didn't follow the script. 7-year-old Maya stood in the center of the dim studio apartment, framed by the flickering light of a street lamp outside that cast long, skeletal shadows across the floor. She was clutching a headless dollar relic of better times so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes didn't go to his face. They tracked the empty space where his left arm used to be. The sleeve pinned neatly to his shoulder, then traveled down to the matte black carbon fiber of his leg. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "Are you staying, or is this a visit?" The words hit Elias harder than the shrapnel ever had. He dropped his duffel bag, the heavy canvas thudding against the floorboards with a sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in his own chest. "I'm staying, Maya. I'm home for good." He moved toward her, his gait awkward as he navigated the sea of cardboard boxes and unpaid bills littering the floor. He wanted to scoop her up, to bury his face in her hair and inhale the scent of childhood that he had memorized to keep himself sane in the desert. But he was terrified of his own strength, or perhaps his own fragility. Maya took a half step back, her expression guarded, her small face a mask of wary calculation. She looked older, far older than a second grader should. The roundness of her cheeks had sharpened into angles, and the vibrant spark he remembered had been replaced by a weary, watchful stillness. "Where's Grandma?" Elias asked, his voice rasping from the dust of the bus ride and the lump in his throat. "She went to the clinic," Maya said, finally looking at his eyes. "She said her back was bad. She said you were coming, but she said not to get my hopes up because men like you always have to go back to the noise." Elias looked around the room, the cinematic grandeur of his homecoming dissolving into the gritty reality of poverty. The refrigerator hummed with a desperate, dying rattle. On the small laminate table sat a single bowl of cereal, the milk gone translucent and warm. The air was stagnant, smelling of old grease and the metallic tang of the radiator. The apartment was a graveyard of the life he'd left behind. A framed photo of his late wife Sarah sat covered in a fine layer of dust on the mantel. In the picture, she was laughing, her hair caught in a breeze that Elias could no longer feel. Next to it was his silver star, tucked inside a velvet box that had grown dull with neglect. He had been a hero in a desert, a man whose word was law and whose presence meant safety for his men. But here, in the shadows of a rent-controlled apartment, he was just a man with a disability status and a bank account that was a graveyard of insufficient funds notices. That first night, the transition from soldier to civilian felt like drowning in slow motion. After Maya's grandmother returned exhausted, cynical and barely able to look Elias in the eye without a mixture of pity and resentment, the small space became a theater of unspoken ghosts. Elias offered to go get dinner, but a quick check of his wallet revealed exactly $6.42. His back pay was tied up in a bureaucratic nightmare of lost paperwork and pending signatures at a regional office 3 hours away. "I'm not hungry, Maya," Elias lied, his stomach cramping with a familiar annoying ache. He had gone 3 days without a real meal in the Kandahar outskirts once. He could handle a night in the kitchen. "You eat the rest of the mac and cheese. I had a big meal on the bus." He watched her eat from across the table. She didn't eat like a child. She ate with a mechanical efficiency, her eyes never leaving his. It wasn't the gaze of a child looking at a father. It was the gaze of a survivor assessing a new variable in her environment. Every time his prosthetic leg shifted or made a metallic click, she flinched, her shoulders hitching toward her ears. "Does it hurt?" she asked suddenly, pointing to the empty sleeve pinned to his shirt. Elias looked down. He thought about the heat, the roar of the blast that had sounded like the world cracking in half, and the smell of ozone and burning rubber. He thought about the brothers he had lost who didn't get a homecoming, not even a broken one. "Only when the wind changes," he said softly, trying for a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But it's okay. I'm a fast learner. I'll figure out how to be a one-armed dad. I bet I can still make the best pancakes in the city." "We don't have mics," Maya said flatly, "and the stove clicks but doesn't get hot." The realization of their situation began to sink in, like lead. He wasn't just a visitor, he was a captain who had returned to a sinking ship. He walked to the window, looking out at the neon sprawl of the city. He could see the silhouettes of people in the building across the street, families sitting down to dinner, TVs flickering with the blue light of sitcoms. They lived in a world of normalcy that felt as distant as the moon. "Can you still pick me up?" Maya asked, her voice small, a tiny crack finally appearing in her defensive armor. Elias stood. His balance was off. His center of gravity shifted forever to the right. He braced his good leg against the table, anchoring himself, and reached out his remaining hand. "Come here, Bug." She approached him tentatively, as if he might vanish if she moved too fast. When he lifted her, his muscles screamed, and the prosthetic socket chafed against his scarred skin, the sweat making the carbon fiber itch, but he didn't let it show. He held her against his chest, feeling the frantic bird-like beat of her heart. For a second, the silence of the hallway was filled with the sound of her breathing, and the scent of her hair, strawberry shampoo and city dust made his eyes sting. Then, he looked over her shoulder and saw the eviction notice tucked under the door, the bright red urgent stamp glaring at him like a sniper's glint in the sun. He was home from the war, yes, but as he stood in the dark clutching his daughter, Elias realized he had just traded one battlefield for another, and in this one, he didn't have a rifle, a radio, or a squad. He only had a daughter who had forgotten how to laugh, and a world that didn't care if he stayed or left. As he tucked Maya into her small bed later that night, he noticed she slept with her shoes on. "Why the shoes, Maya?" he whispered, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. She looked at him with wide, solemn eyes. "Just in case we have to leave fast. Grandma says we might have to go soon." Elias sat on the edge of the bed long after she fell asleep. He looked at his one hand, calloused, scarred, and trembling. He had been trained to survive the most hostile environments on Earth, but the sight of his daughter's sneakers on those bedsheets broke him in a way the war never could. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a father whose only mission was to make sure those shoes stayed off the bed, and he had no idea how he was going to win. The radiator gave one final, dying hiss, and the apartment plunged into a deep, freezing silence. Elias leaned his head against the wall, listening to the muffled sounds of the city outside, realizing that the hardest part of the war wasn't the fighting. It was the coming back to find there was nothing left to fight with.
The weeks that followed were a blur of humiliating job interviews and the crushing weight of social judgment. Elias found that the "thank you for your service" platitudes ended exactly where the entry-level requirements began. In the civilian world, his silver star was a pretty trinket, not a resume builder. Managers looked at his empty sleeve and his limp and saw a liability, not a leader. They saw PTSD in the way he held his jaw tight, and unreliability in the way he had to coordinate his schedule around VA appointments that were perpetually rescheduled by a system that seemed designed to exhaust him. To the city, he was a ghost. To the job market, he was a broken machine. To Maya, he was becoming a source of quiet, agonizing tension. Maya had become a ghost in her own home. She stopped asking for toys. She even stopped asking for fruit. She began to hide her school flyers for field trips or book fairs, tucking them deep into the trash so he wouldn't see the price tags. She knew the math of their life better than a child should. She knew that a gallon of milk cost 3 bus tokens, and that rent was a mountain they couldn't climb. She had developed a habit of checking the pantry when she thought he wasn't looking. Her small face falling at the sight of the dwindling stack of canned beans. The silence in the apartment wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a submarine taking on water. Elias spent his mornings in the public library, the only place with free heat and internet, scrolling through job boards until his vision blurred. He was overqualified for security work they didn't want, a one-armed guard, and underqualified for the desk jobs that would accommodate his physical limitations. "I just need a chance," he told a hiring manager at a local warehouse. "I led a platoon. I managed millions of dollars in equipment and the lives of 40 men. I can manage a floor." The man hadn't even looked up from his clipboard, the fluorescent lights reflecting off his balding head. The insurance premiums for a guy with a prosthetic leg and one arm. "Sorry, Captain. We're a high-paced environment." "You'd be a bottleneck. Come back when you've got a certificate in data entry." Elias had walked out into the biting wind, his prosthetic leg feeling like a lead weight. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a scrap of metal left behind on a battlefield. By the third week of the heat wave, the apartment had become a pressure cooker. The humidity was stifling, the kind of heat that made the asphalt bubble and tempers flare. The electricity had been cut that morning, a mistake the utility company said would take 48 hours to rectify, though Elias knew the mistake was the $200 he couldn't pay. Myers sat on the floor, trying to color by the fading light of the afternoon sun, her forehead glistening with sweat. Elias couldn't stand to be inside. The walls felt like they were closing in, mocking his inability to provide the simplest of comforts. A cool breeze, a cold glass of water. He retreated to the fire escape, the only place he could find a moment of perceived privacy. He sat on the rusted iron slats, the heat of the metal seeping through his jeans. Had a rusted can of WD-40 he had scavenged from a dumpster and was trying to oil his prosthetic hinge. The joint had been screaming all day, a high-pitched metallic whine that set his nerves on edge. Every step he took echoed through the floorboards like a condemnation, announcing his presence and his brokenness to everyone in the building. He needed it to be quiet. He needed to be invisible. He needed to be the silent protector he thought a father should be, the kind who absorbs the world's blows without making a sound. His neighbor, Mr. Man who had spent 40 years yelling at neighborhood kids to stay off his porch and whose only company was a mangy, bunny-eared cat named Sarge, was sitting in a frayed lawn chair just 5 feet away on the adjoining balcony. Henderson was a relic of the neighborhood's past. A man made of leather and gristle who seemed to exist solely to scowl at the passing of time. Elias kept his head down, bracing for a complaint. He felt the hot sting of failure. He was a warrior who couldn't even fix his own leg without waking the neighborhood. His only hand shook with a tremor he couldn't control. It was the adrenaline of shame. The tremors of a man who had survived an IED, but was being undone by a can of lubricant. He fumbled with the oil can, trying to aim the straw into the hinge while balancing the weight of his prosthetic limb. The slick metal slid through his sweaty fingers. The can clattered down the fire escape, bouncing off the iron railings with a series of deafening clangs that sounded like bells in the narrow alleyway before hitting the trash-strewn concrete below. Elias let out a sharp, guttural sounder, half-sob, half-growl, of pure, unadulterated frustration. He slammed his fist against the railing. It wasn't just for the can. It was for the medals that couldn't pay for electricity. It was for the wife who wasn't there to hold him when the night got too long. It was for the daughter who looked at him like he was a ticking bomb, waiting for the day he'd finally explode or vanish back into the noise. He slumped against the railing, his forehead resting on the cool, rusted iron. He felt the gaze of the world on his back, mocking his brokenness. He thought about the men he'd saved, the lives he'd protected, wondered why the hardest battle he'd ever fought was happening in a 5-story walk-up in a city that did know his name. "You're doing it again." Henderson's voice cracked through the humid air. It wasn't an insult. It was a statement of fact. Elias didn't look up. He couldn't. "Doing what?" "Suffocating," the old man said. "Oh." He set his newspaper down, the dry crinkle of the paper loud in the stillness. "You're holding your breath like you're still underwater. You think if you don't make a sound, the world won't notice you're drowning. But kid, I can hear the water rushing into your lungs from over here. I can hear it every time you walk across that floor. Elias finally raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and fierce. I've got it under control, Mr. Henderson. I don't need a lecture on how to handle my life. What the hell you do? Henderson countered, leaning forward. His eyes weren't mocking. They were knowing. You got a girl in there who's forgotten what a birthday cake tastes like because she's too busy worrying if the lights are gone. Nah, stay on. She's 7. Elias, she should be worrying about lost crayons, not the rent. 2. You think being a man is about carrying the whole world on your back. That's not a man. That's an aunt. And even aunts have a colony. Elias turned away, his jaw tight. He wanted to scream that Henderson didn't understand. He didn't understand the pride of a soldier, the need to be the one who provides. The absolute terror of showing a child that her hero is human and, worse, that her hero is failing. But then he looked through the window. Maya was standing there, her face pressed against the glass. She wasn't looking at the sunset or the city lights. Chills, looking at his hand, the one that was shaking. She was looking at the way he was slumped, the way the captain looked defeated by a $3 can of oil. He realized then that his strength was actually a wall. It was a fortress he had built to keep the pain out, but all it was doing was keeping his daughter in the dark. He was so busy trying to be a statue of a hero that he had forgotten how to be a father. He was so afraid of being a charity case that he was becoming a ghost. The city around them began to roar a siren in the distance, the screech of a subway train, a rhythmic thumping of bass from a car below. The world was loud and indifferent, and Elias felt smaller than he ever had in the middle of a firefight. At least there, he had a mission. Here, his only mission was to survive, and he was losing. I don't know how to do this, Elias whispered, the words finally breaking through his grit. I was trained to lead. I was trained to fix things. But I can't fix this. I can't fix me. Henderson stood up, his own knees popping with the sound of age. He walked to the edge of his fire escape, reaching out a hand that was just as scarred and weathered as a Thor changes, the shape of a man. Elias and Henderson said softly, You can't fit into the old mold anymore. You gotta let the new shape find its place. And you can't do that while you're trying to hide the cracks. He looked down at the alley where the oil can lay forgotten among the shadows. You're so busy trying to be the shield, Henderson said, that you've forgotten what you're supposed to be protecting. It's not your pride, Elias. It's her. Elias looked at his daughter through the glass again. She waved, a tiny, hesitant motion of her hand. The weight of his pride felt suddenly, sharply heavier than the carbon fiber on his leg. He realized that the greatest sacrifice he could make was UNT's life, or his limbs it was his ego. It was the willingness to be seen in his brokenness so that his daughter could finally see the light. Henderson watched him, a silent sentry on the neighboring balcony. The two men stood there for a long time, two veterans of different wars, bound by the same silent struggle. The sun finally dipped below the skyline, casting the city in shades of bruised purple and gold. I don't have anything to give back, Elias said. That's the point of a village, kid, Henderson replied, turning back toward his door. You don't give back until your garden grows. Right now, your ground is just fallow. Let us help you till the soil. As Elias stepped back into the dark apartment, Maya met him at the door. She didn't ask about the oil can or the noise. She just reached out and took his hand, the shaking one, and held it between both of hers. It's okay, Daddy, she whispered. We're home. 2. The weight was still there, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel like it was going to crush him. It felt like something he could finally, slowly, learn to carry with help.
The silence that followed Mr. Henderson's observation was more deafening than the clatter of the falling oil can. Elias stood on the rusted fire escape, the iron biting into his palm. He felt exposed, stripped of the uniform and the rank that once acted as his armor. For years, captain was a title that commanded respect. Here, in the humid twilight of a city that never stopped moving, He was just a man with a missing arm and a spirit that was fraying at the edges like an old battle guy. The night air was thick, carrying the scent of asphalt and the distant, greasy aroma of a corner deli. Elias waited for Henderson to turn away, to offer the dismissive shrug of a neighbor who had seen too much and cared too little. But the old man stayed rooted to his spot. His presence was like a lighthouse in a storm, weathered, immovable, and annoyingly bright. "You think you'll be the first one to come back from a ghost dance and find the world doesn't recognize you?" Henderson asked. His voice wasn't unkind, but it had the rough texture of a man who had survived by swallowing his own bile. Elias looked at him, his breath hitching. "I have to be this stone. Henderson, if I crack, Maya falls. She's 7. She doesn't have a mother, and her father is ... He's half a man. If I show her that I'm drowning, what does she have left to hold on to?" "She's not holding on to a statue, Elias. She's holding on to a father," Henderson said, his eyes narrowing. "And right now, you're so cold and so hard that she's liable to freeze to death just being near you. You think you're protecting her from the truth? Cared to like radar. They don't see the bills, but they feel the hunger in the air. They feel the way you hold your breath when you look at the mailbox. You're not hiding the war. You're just bringing the trenches into the living room." The words stung because they were true. Elias thought of Maya sleeping with her shoes on. He thought of her hiding the school flyers. He wasn't protecting her. He was teaching her how to live in a state of permanent siege. "I don't have a choice," Elias rasped. "I go to the VA and I'm a number. I go to the interviews and I'm a liability. I go to the bank and I'm a zero. The only place I'm still a man is in that room with her, and I will not let her see me as a charity case." "Charity?" Henderson scoffed, leaning his elbows on the railing. "Is that what you call it when a comrade pulls you out of a ditch? Is that what you call it when you share a foxhole? You're still thinking like a man who's under fire. Elias, you're waiting for the next blast so you've got your back to the wall. But look at where you are. There are no snipers on those rooftops. The only thing aiming at you right now is your own damn pride, and it's got a perfect line of sight on your heart." Elias felt the hot, defensive spark that had kept him alive in the desert flare up again. He wanted to shout about the injustice of it or the way he had sacrificed his body for a country that couldn't even process his disability claim in under 6 months. He wanted to scream at the sky until his lungs gave out. But Henderson didn't flinch. He reached into the pocket of his plaid shirt and pulled out a small, silver coiner sobriety token, worn smooth by years of rubbing. "I lost 10 years to the bottle because I wouldn't let anyone in," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I lost a wife and a son because I thought needing help was a weakness. I thought if I admitted I couldn't handle the noise in my head or the way my hands shook when the 4th of July fireworks went off, I wasn't a man anymore. It took me losing everything, and I mean everything." Elias realized that the hardest thing a man can ever do isn't to fight. Fighting is easy, you just point and shoot. The hardest thing is to surrender to the people who want to love you. He stepped closer to the railing, the gap between their fire escapes suddenly feeling very small. The city noise seemed to fade into a dull hum, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the distant siren of an ambulance. "You're a good soldier, Elias, maybe too good. You're still trying to win a war that's already over," Henderson continued. He paused, looking out over the skyline, the lights of the city twinkling like fallen stars. Then he turned back to Elias with an intensity that demanded attention. "You know, Captain, a man isn't measured by how he carries his shield, but by how he lets his village carry him." The sentence hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. It bypassed his defenses, cutting through the layers of "I am fine" and the tactical stoicism he had worn like a second skin. It was a radical, terrifying concept. For Elias, the shield was his identity. It was his competence, his utility, his value as a human being. To let someone else carry him felt like admitting he was useless. It felt like the landmine winning all over again, taking his dignity after it had already taken his arm. But then he looked at Henderson, this grumpy, isolated old man who was reaching out across a 5-foot gap of rusted iron. Henderson wasn't offering pity. He was offering a bridge. He was recognizing the warrior in Elias and telling him that even warriors need a campfire and a tribe. Elias realized that the village wasn't a sign of his failure. It was the only thing that could save Maya. By refusing help, he was denying her the chance to see what real community looked like. He was teaching her that the world was a cold, indifferent place where you had to suffer in silence. Henderson didn't wait for a response. He knew the seeds had been planted. He turned and retreated into his apartment, his footsteps heavy on the linoleum. A moment later he returned carrying a large steaming Tupperware container and a small, brown paper bag. The aroma hit Elias before the container even reached the table, a rich, savory scent of beef onions and slow-cooked comfort. "My wife passed 3 years ago," Henderson said, his voice thickening, "but I still cook like she's in the other room. I made too much pot roast. Again, it's got the potatoes and the carrots the way she liked them, and there's some apples in the bag. They're crisp, good for a kid's teeth." He didn't hand it over like a handout. He set it on the small, rusted table that sat between their fire escape doors, a neutral ground of sorts. "Don't you dare let it go to waste," Henderson grumbled, regaining his crusty exterior as if he were embarrassed by his own kindness. "It's a debt you'll pay back when your garden grows, Elias, not a day before." Now get inside before that girl of yours thinks you've jumped." Elias reached out his trembling hand, the one made of flesh and bone. He picked up the warm container. The heat seeped into his skin, a tangible contrast to the cold, mechanical feel of his prosthetic. For the first time since he had returned, he felt a flicker of something other than dread. "Thank you," Elias whispered. The words felt foreign, rusty from disuse, like a gate that hadn't been opened in a decade. "Don't thank me," Henderson called out, his hand on the door handle. "Just eat. And for God's sake, tell that girl a story that doesn't involve a drill sergeant. Tell her about something beautiful. She needs to hear it. And so do you." Elias walked back into his apartment. The darkness was still there, the electricity still cut, but it didn't feel as oppressive. He set the food down on the laminate table. Maya looked up from the floor, her eyes widening as she saw the steam rising from the container. "What's that, Daddy?" Elias sat down, his prosthetic leg clicking as he settled into the chair. He didn't try to hide it this time. He didn't try to tuck his empty sleeve away. He just looked at her really, looked at her hand, saw the hunger in her eyes, not just for a meal, but for the man he used to be. "It's dinner, Maya," he said, his voice steadying. "It's a gift from our neighbor, from Mr. Henderson." "The grumpy man who yells at the cats?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "No," Elias said, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind her ear. "Just a man who knows what it's like to be in a village, and he wanted to make sure you had some carrots." As they ate by the light of a single candle Elias found in the back of a drawer, the silence in the room finally began to break. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore, it was the quiet of a shared moment. Elias didn't talk about the VA or the interviews. He told her about a dog he had seen in the park that morning, a golden retriever that was trying to catch its own tail and failing spectacularly. He told her about the way the clouds had looked like giant mashed potatoes over the harbor. And for the first time since he had stepped off that bus, Maya laughed. It was a small, fragile sound, like a bird chirping after a long winter, but to Elias it was louder than any explosion. He realized then that the shield he had been carrying was actually a cage, and for the first time in his life, he felt brave enough to step out of it. He looked at the empty Tupperware and the core of the apple Maya was happily munching on. He realized that Henderson was right. He couldn't fix the stove today. He couldn't pay the rent today. But he could let himself be helped. He could accept the pot roast. He could accept the conversation. And in doing so, he was showing Maya that it was okay to be human. That night, for the first time, Maya took off her shoes before she climbed into bed. She didn't ask if they were leaving. She just kissed his cheek and fell asleep within minutes. Elias sat in the living room, staring at the silver coin Henderson had shown him. He realized that his mission had changed. It wasn't about being the hero anymore. It was about being the man who survived the peace. It was about building a village, one Tupperware container and one conversation at a time. He picked up a pen and a scrap of paper. He didn't write a list of bills. He wrote a note to the vet center, a real one, asking for help with his claim not as a demand, but as a request. The dam had broken, and for the first time, the water felt like life, not like drowning. The transformation of Elias's life didn't arrive with a blare of trumpets or a sudden windfall of gold. It began with the slow, deliberate work of tilling a frozen field. After the night of the pot roast, the apartment felt different, less like a bunker and more like a home that was simply waiting for the sun to rise. The first true sign of spring in Elias's soul came 2 weeks later. Following Mr. Henderson's advice, Elias stopped treating his disability claim as a tactical maneuver and started treating it as a conversation. He returned to the Veterans Affairs office, but this time, he didn't sit in the back row with his jaw clenched and his eyes scanning for exits. He sat at the front. When he met with a caseworker, a woman named Sarah, who had seen 1,000 faces just like as he did, Unity led with his rank. He led with his daughter. "I'm not here to fight the system today," Elias told her, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm here because my daughter sleeps with her shoes on because she is afraid we'll be evicted. I need to know how to let the village carry us." Sarah looked up from her computer, her expression shifting from bureaucratic exhaustion to genuine surprise. She spent the next 3 hours digging through his file, finding the pending paperwork that had been buried under a mountain of digital red tape. By the time Elias left, he didn't have a check, but he had a direct line and a promise. But the real harvest wasn't in the paperwork, it was in the neighborhood. Elias began to spend his afternoons on the fire escape, not to hide, but to be present. He and Mr. Henderson developed a shorthand, a language of shared silence and occasional grunts of agreement. One afternoon, Henderson handed him a wrench. "My kitchen sink is acting like a geyser," the old man grumbled. "My eyes aren't what they used to be, and I can't get the leverage." "You still got that grip strength in your right hand, Captain?" Elias hesitated. He looked at his one hand, then at the wrench. "I'm not a plumber, Henderson. I didn't ask for a plumber. I asked for a man who knows how to follow an order. Now get over here." For 2 hours, Elias worked under Henderson's sink. It was frustrating, agonizing work. He had to use his knees to brace the pipe and his teeth to hold the flashlight, while Henderson sat on a kitchen stool, narrating the history of the building's plumbing. But when the leak finally stopped, the surge of accomplishment that washed over Elias was more intoxicating than any medal. He had fixed something. He had been useful not as a weapon, but as a neighbor. As the weeks turned into months, the the village began to expand. It turned out that the neighborhood was full of people who had been waiting for Elias to stop being a statue. The woman from 3B, a seamstress, offered to mend Maya's school clothes in exchange for Elias helping her carry heavy bolts of fabric up the stairs. The owner of the corner bodega started accidentally over-ordering crates of apples and oranges, insisting that Elias take the spoiled fruit that was actually perfectly ripe. The turning point for Maya came on a Saturday in late October. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and turning leaves. Elias had finally secured a job, not as a warehouse worker or a security guard, but as a logistics coordinator for a local non-profit called Vets for the City. They needed someone who could organize complex movements of food and supplies for homebound seniors. It turned out that a man who could supply a platoon in a combat zone was a godsend for a charity trying to navigate city traffic. With his first real paycheck, Elias didn't buy a new TV or a fancy dinner. He walked into a shoe store. When he got home, Maya was sitting at the table, drawing a picture of the view from their window. Elias set a box down in front of her. "What's this, Daddy? Open it." She pulled the lid off to find a pair of bright, sparkling purple sneakers, the kind that lit up when you stepped, but more importantly, they were indoor shoes. "These are for the house, Maya," Elias said, kneeling beside her. "Because from now on, when we're inside these walls, we're safe. The war is over. You don't have to be ready to run anymore." Maya looked at the shoes, then at her father. She didn't put them on right away. Instead, she stood up and walked to the door. She kicked off her old, worn-out sneakers, the ones she had slept in for months, and left them by the mat. Then, she stepped into the purple ones and stomped a heel. The heels flashed a brilliant, defiant red. She looked up at Elias, and for the first time, her laughter wasn't a fragile chirp. It was a full, belly-deep sound that filled every corner of the studio apartment, chasing out the last of the shadows. The story reached its cinematic climax during the neighborhood's first harvest block party. The street was blocked off with orange cones, and the smell of grilled corn and charcoal hung in the air. Elias was at the grill, flipping burgers with a specialized spatula he'd fashioned himself. He moved with a grace he hadn't possessed 6 months ago. His limp was still there, but it was no longer a stutter. In his step it was a rhythm. Mr. Henderson sat nearby, holding Sarge the cat, watching the festivities with a look of begrudging satisfaction. Maya was in the center of a group of children, playing a game of tag. She was the fastest one there, her purple shoes flashing like strobes against the darkening asphalt. A woman Elias had seen at the VA, a younger veteran who had lost his sight in an IED blast, sat at a nearby table, looking overwhelmed by the noise. Elias handed the spatula to another neighbor and walked over to her. He didn't offer pity, he offered a plate. "The burgers are a little charred," Elias said, sitting down beside her. "But the potato salad is Henderson's wife's recipe. It's the best thing you'll ever taste." The woman smiled, her eyes searching for his voice. "Thank you, Captain Just Elias," he said. "And if you need help finding the village, I know the way. I was lost for a while myself." As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the street, Elias looked up at the apartment buildings. He saw the windows glowing with warm light. He saw the fire escapes where he had once sat in despair, now decorated with potted plants and laundry. He realized then that his neighbor's one sentence hadn't just changed his life. It had redefined his understanding of humanity. He had spent his youth learning how to be a shield, thinking that strength was a solitary burden. He had been wrong. Real strength was the ability to be a link in a chain. It was the courage to say, "I cannot do this alone," and the humility to let others stand beside him. Maya ran over to him, her face flushed with play, her hair a wild nest of curls. She leaned against his good side, her head resting on his hip. "Are you happy, Daddy?" she asked, looking up at the stars beginning to peek through the city haze. Elias wrapped his arm around her, drawing her close. He looked at his village, the grumpy old man with the pot roast, the bodega owner, the caseworker who fought for him, the neighbors who shared their bread. He felt the weight of his prosthetic leg, a reminder of what he had lost. But he felt the warmth of his daughter's hand, a reminder of what he had won. "I'm home, Maya," he said, his voice thick with a peace he had never thought possible. "I'm finally home." The camera of memory would have panned back then, showing the small girl and the tall, one-armed man standing in the heart of a city that was no longer a battlefield, but a garden. The lights of Maya's shoes flickered one last time, red, blue, and purple as they walked toward their building. They weren't running from anything anymore. They were just walking home, carried by the invisible hands of a village that had refused to let them fall. Elias knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be nights when the noise returned, and days when the prosthetic chafed. But he no longer feared the silence of the hallway, because now, that silence was always broken by the sound of a daughter's laughter, the most beautiful music a soldier had ever heard.